Good evening from India. My name is Kumar. I'm the founding Vice-Chancellor of OP Jindal Global University. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to the second day of this global virtual conference on reimagining and transforming the university. We have the third keynote address of the conference on the theme, the future of internationalization, implications for India. We have with us Professor Dr. Philip ALTBACH, Founding Director and Research Professor, Center for International Higher Education, Boston College, United States of America. Philip ALTBACH was the 2004 to 2006 Distinguished Scholar Leader for the New Century Scholars Initiative of the Fulbright Program, was given the Holohan Award for Distinguished Contributions to International Education by NASPA. He has taught at Harvard University, the University of Wisconsin, the State University of New York at Buffalo. He is author of numerous books, including on several aspects of Indian higher education. Dr. ALTBACH is a member of the International Advisory Committee of the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, the Graduate School at Shanghai Jiao University. He's a guest professor at universities around the world. Thank you very much, Philip, for accepting our invitation. We have with us Professor Stephen P. Marks, FRANÇOIS-XAVIER BAGNOUD Professor of Health and Human Rights at Harvard University. Again, Steve does not need much of an introduction to most of Indian audience. Steve obtained his Master of Arts degree from Harvard University, also studied at Stanford and many other institutions. For a while, he also worked at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. His earlier work has dealt with biotechnology and human rights, impunity for mass atrocities, terrorism and human rights, cultural rights, access to medicines, and human rights education. He has numerous publications to his credit and somebody who has been keenly looking at issues relating to higher education from the standpoint of India and the world. Thank you very much, Steve, for joining us. Without further ado, let me invite Professor Philip ALTBACH to deliver his keynote address.
It's a great pleasure to be involved in this conference on a range of important topics. And I believe you have already been discussing a little bit internationalization, so I hope I'm not going to be too much repeating. But I want to cover a few definitions. I want to discuss a little bit what's happening around the world. I want to discuss especially the crisis that we're in at the moment. And I want to conclude with a few comments about India's role in all of this. Internationalization, of course, is one of the hallmarks of 21st century higher education. It's undergoing significant changes globally, and also India is just starting, frankly speaking, to think about internationalization. India, if I might say, has been a very insular, Swadeshi, if you will, higher education system. And now, for the first time in a serious way, it's beginning to look outward, and I think there's some challenges to that. What do we mean by internationalization? With the globalization of economies in the post-World War II period and the development of a global knowledge economy, we've seen the importance of universities in this arrangement. And we've seen universities increasingly look overseas, across borders, for programs and for involvement in various activities to make their work more effective. Internationalization includes, of course, student and faculty mobility. I'll get to this in a moment, which is usually referred to as internationalization abroad. That is the role of universities, and by the way, individuals, because most of us have an internationalization strategy of our own. Did we study overseas? Did we take a degree else in another country? Have we been a visiting scholar? And so on. So it's not only universities and now governments that have an internationalization interest, but it's also individuals. A newer aspect of internationalization is what we call internationalization at home. And these include efforts to internationalize the curriculum of higher education institutions, to involve students who don't have the opportunity to travel internationally. And that is, by the way, the huge majority of students, and will be even a larger majority of students in the COVID and even post-COVID environment. So it's really important, I think, to ensure that all of our students have access to some kind of global knowledge, global interests, and so on. Universities, of course, have always been international. The early European universities emerging from the Middle Ages used a common language, Latin, and had a common curriculum. Universities in other parts of the world, let's give the example of Nalanda in India, educated a multinational student body, also in a common language. So India's internationalization goes back a very, very long time. Let me discuss for a couple of minutes current trends in internationalization. Student mobility, of course, is the key. It's the largest aspect of internationalization all around the world. There are more than 5 million students who are studying outside their home countries, the majority studying in the major English-speaking industrialized countries, and the large majority coming from Asian middle income and developing countries. And of course, India is a major contributor to the student mobility all around the world. Student mobility has become a $300 billion industry worldwide, with tuition that students pay, their contribution to the economies where they study, and so on. So it's big business. International students have become a major income source for such countries as Australia and the United Kingdom. And I would make the argument, as many have, that these countries are overly dependent on international students and use them in many ways to balance their budgets as what some would call, and maybe in the Indian context, I shouldn't say this, a cash cow. So internationalization has become commercialized in many ways, too many ways, I think. Faculty and scholar mobility is also a major aspect of internationalization. Again, the pattern is from developing and middle income countries to the rich countries, and those scholars, many of whom stay, make an important contribution to the universities in the countries where they settle down. And of course, there are many Indians and Pakistanis and others who are very successful academics, even university presidents and others working in the United States and other countries. It would, of course, be a very good idea if some of those people contributed a lot to the development of higher education in their own country, and some do. But I think there is much room to expand the contributions and the role of the various diasporas around the world to get them involved in the activities back in their countries of origin, because they make a tremendous contribution to the country where they currently reside, and some of them make a contribution back home as well. So we need to think about that, actually, as an important aspect of internationalization. Broadly, as I mentioned, there has been a significant commercialization of internationalization in the 21st century, and this shows no sign of diminishing. And I speak here of agents, and they are rife in India, many agents who are guiding students, often not very well, to universities overseas, collecting from them and their families significant amounts of money, but also other kinds of commercial programs, the whole, what we might call the English language industry that exists, again, significantly in India, but also in many other parts of the world. So there's significant commercialization. And as I mentioned, universities that receive international students often think of those students in commercial terms. This, I believe, maybe I'm being idealistic here, is kind of a bad idea. So there's been commercialization. We can see also branch campuses and joint degrees. There's been a major expansion of branch campuses all around the world. And there are at least 260 of them in various countries. Many exist in the Middle East, but also in China and elsewhere. The major countries establishing branch campuses are the UK, Australia, to some extent the United States, interestingly enough, Russia, and of course, India has a couple of branch campuses in other countries outside of India, I think mainly in the Middle East. So that movement has been an important part of internationalization, as has been joint degrees, partnerships of different sorts, and so on. So this has become a very, very diverse and significant, if you might say, industry that has emerged and is of great importance to universities, to governments in different countries. Let me conclude with this sort of definitional aspect with a few comments on internationalization at home. Here I'm referring to the efforts by universities, so far mostly in rich countries, but I think countries like India and many others need to start thinking seriously about internationalization at home to provide students with knowledge of what's going on in other countries, with maybe using IT to build links to students and faculty in other countries, using faculty expertise that exists on all of our campuses to develop more programs on our campuses and to leverage the skill and the knowledge of our existing international students to work with our local domestic students. So there are many aspects, and of course, to internationalize the curriculum, to make sure that we know in all fields, including scientific fields, that there are international aspects and that we have international responsibilities. And I know my colleague Steve on this panel has worked deeply in that particular area. So internationalization at home is something of great importance. Let me spend a few minutes on the current crisis. Of course, COVID-19 has affected many aspects of higher education, as well as economies and societies worldwide, and will continue even after the immediate crisis ends. And let's hope that soon, but I rather doubt it. Even before COVID, the rapid expansion of student mobility had slowed somewhat, and I think COVID will have a dramatic and immense short-term impact, and I think a significant medium-term impact as well. That is, I think we will see lower numbers of students traveling outside their own countries to study. And this will create significant financial disruptions for some receiving countries and institutions, and will of course cause some rethinking on the part of local students. And by the way, it means, I think, it means that there may be an opportunity at home in countries such as India, but also China and many others, to develop very high quality higher education institutions that can attract students who might otherwise have been thinking of going abroad. I do believe that there will be some rethinking of branch campuses as universities reconsider both the financial and practical impact of campus mobility. Branch campuses are difficult to fund and to maintain. And I know that India is thinking of, it has passed legislation now to permit universities from other countries to establish branches in India. And I think that's going to be deeply problematic. I'll say a little more about that in a couple minutes. The increased use and growing sophistication of IT-enabled teaching and learning is likely to be used as a key element of internationalization, as well as for joint degree programs, informal programs, research collaboration, and the like. So I think we're at a kind of inflection point. We've had IT around for quite a while. Some of it works well, some of it doesn't, but we're really using it more and learning a bit how to develop it. The use of English as a key medium for degree programs and related activities is likely to continue, and I think that's important. The commercialization trends, which I've mentioned already, are likely also to continue, but they are going to face tremendous challenges, maybe from regulatory agencies within countries, and certainly from the changing environment, which I've mentioned already. Let me conclude for a few minutes on the implications of all this for India, because I know much of the audience for this event is in India. India, of course, is just starting its internationalization agenda, and I think we'll face very serious headwinds. Things are going to be more difficult than in normal times because of the crisis, and I think India enters this arena without much experience and without much infrastructure for it. India, for example, in the new higher education policy that's been approved by the government just in the last few weeks, I think, wants to have top 100 universities establish branch campuses in India. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. First of all, top universities require, if you look at the experience in other countries, very, very heavy subsidies by the sponsoring countries and institutions. And they will be, in the light of COVID and the light of the crises, which I've mentioned already in this discussion, even more hesitant than before. So some countries may be interested to develop relationships with India. India is, of course, a very important country and is opening its doors to the outside world for the first time. And how India can manage this, how India can select among institutions that may be useful, may be valuable to work with Indian colleagues and institutions, is a difficult question which deserves a good deal of forethought. India lacks infrastructure for internationalization in almost all of its universities. OP Jindal Global is a rare exception. There are a couple of others, especially in the private sector in India, that do a pretty good job, but most Indian universities have neither the facilities, nor the staff, nor the experience to enter into the international field in an effective way. And that needs to be seriously thought of. I myself have been at the, quote, international offices and centers of a couple of well-established public universities in India, and I have been slightly shocked by the not very impressive arrangements that exist in those institutions. So India is at an early stage. It shouldn't rush, but it should devote appropriate resources, and I think can, in the long run, do a decent job. Individual efforts by top Indian universities in establishing links to the international market have already had some success, and I think other Indian universities can probably learn from those experiences, maybe including Jindal's, Symbiosis, and a few others that have been involved in this area for some period of time. India's attracting large numbers of international students will be difficult without a major investment by India in facilities and probably scholarships. India already does some of this, mainly focused on Africa, I think, and that's a good thing. And I think the large majority of potential international students to India will probably come, as it now does, from other South Asian countries, from Africa, and perhaps from the Middle East. The chances of attracting significant numbers of degree-seeking students from Western countries, I think, is quite slim, to be frank. But there are other things to do that can be done to internationalize and to engage with students from top universities around the world, and that is sort of short-term programs, research collaboration, especially in areas where India has a significant advantage, and so on. So I think there are challenges, but I think this is a very important topic. And let me stop at this point and ask for questions and some further comments from Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip, for that really comprehensive and compelling vision of what internationalization could mean for India and possibly the challenges and indeed the opportunities. I deeply appreciate the fact that you were candid in your comments and provided us with a realistic perspective of what the future could be when it comes to internationalization in India is concerned. Let me now call upon Professor Stephen P. Marks to deliver his presidential address. Steve.
Raj, thank you very much for the honor of being part of this extraordinary two-day conference that you've organized, virtual conference, addressing the critical issues facing the education community and universities for the future as we try to understand how to reimagine and transform universities. It's a very ambitious goal, reimagine and transform. And I think Philip ALTBACH's presentation was a challenge to reimagine with a view toward transforming the way internationalization occurs in the university context. Let me say, by way of a brief personal introduction, I admire Phil ALTBACH as one of the world leaders whose role in organizing internationalization of education has not only improved the situation and brought insights into the way institutions in the United States, like Boston College, where he is, and which I admire very much. But if you look at his CV and the brief allusions that you made to it, Raj, who else has ever been so deeply involved, not only in India, but in Russia and China and so on? It is truly remarkable at that educational leadership level to have played that role. My introduction and awareness of the internationalization of education comes in fact, or starts in fact, with being a student. Rather than being a university administrator, having benefited from my own education and affiliation with institutions and then branching out to internationalization, I was a beneficiary of that process at a time before the internationalization and globalization that Phil was talking about. I studied in France and Germany and the Middle East and so on, and have taught in universities in places as far away as Cambodia and so on. So, but I got introduced to the internationalization of education as an international student struggling to, with all the issues that you deal with. And of course, things have improved considerably with the trends that Phil was referring to of branch campuses and joint programs and the other types of activities that he alluded to. Now, let me, in making some reflections and observations on the insights that Phil shared with us, return to a couple of his main points relating to student mobility, faculty mobility, and commercialization. Among the challenges that the pandemic has posed for maintaining these modalities of internationalization with particular reference to India are, as he said, the teaching and research implications. And I would like to mention briefly that the teaching dimension is one in which we have learned a lot very fast, and various other panels in this conference have alluded to the use of information and communication technology and the strides that are being made and will have to be made in the future. And we're succeeding in that area. We're improving. I know that in my own university, we have had to transform the teaching modalities and use the best techniques, and we're trying to learn from others and improve that situation. That's more on the positive side. On the intermediate level, research activities have been severely curtailed as a result of this. International research that entail field research, going to countries, doing surveys and so on, is virtually at a standstill. Serious problems there. However, collaboration among researchers from different countries continues to be possible through the information and communication technology that we're using. The most negative dimension of that, of course, is how we have been dependent on travel. But from the perspective of the climate emergency, I can't be too worried about that, because if we are reducing the consumption of fossil fuels through air travel, reducing the air travel, it's probably going to be a good thing for the planet, but it's not going to be a good thing for collaboration in research and education the way we've known it and the way that Phil was alluding to it. So I would like to add a dimension that has not been mentioned so far, and I did not hear much about it at the other sessions, is what are the impacts of how we're groping to try to maintain internationalization in education, especially in India with all the challenges that Phil alluded to, at a time when we were placing a high priority on the climate emergency, and of course our mind is on other things now. One of the dimensions, one of the curious dimensions of this whole situation of the pandemic we're living through is that it has provided some restoration of natural habitats in ways that human agency would not have done. But we're not going to be able to maintain that. As we restore activities, including international education, we're going to have to confront not only how we restore the types of exchanges that Phil was alluding to, but we're also going to have to face the challenge of how do we do this in such a way that does not return us to a path of self-destruction, of destruction of the planet and the destruction of civilization. To conclude, I wanted to mention another dimension that was not alluded to yet, which is the question of the travel and foreign students. Phil laid stress on the extremely important role that foreign students have. I would like to, and this is not to be focusing only on my own institution, but I think that the challenge that was faced by universities in the United States when the authorities in Washington tried to deny visas to students who were not taking classes in person and only taking them virtually, led to the denial of their visas until this was challenged in a lawsuit brought by Harvard University and MIT that turned out to be successful. In responding to the outcome of that, the president of Harvard, Larry BAGNOUD, said, "Higher education in the United States seeks and attracts the best and the brightest students from around the world. They strengthen our universities immeasurably, and we aim to provide them with the best education possible in a virtuous cycle that benefits all of us. Some will seek to stay in this country thanks to the freedoms and opportunity that they find here, and those who return will do so enriched by the values they hold dear. That's the ideal. That's the ideal we're working towards. Philip alluded to the quite realistic fact that, especially in Australia and the UK, this has enormous commercial implications to the tune, as he reminded us, of $300 billion. So the question is, we need to balance the value that transformed me as a young person studying abroad and transformed me as an academic now, having the great privilege of working with Siraj Kumar at the founding of OP Jindal Global University and currently being a member of the governing body. I'm extremely proud of that and of the work that has been accomplished as an ideal of the sort of international education that we have. But we have to face those other challenges. How do we do this in a way that is sensitive to the climate emergency, that is addressing that balance between utilizing foreign students as a source of income versus the ideal that the president of Harvard University was alluding to in the quotation that I just gave you. So I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to be part of this and to reflect with you and the participants in this session who are attending and are going to pose questions in a minute as we try to grapple with these issues that face the internationalization of education with particular reference to India.
Thank you.
Those are my preliminary observations, Raj. Happy to be part of this.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that. We have a number of questions, and before I take up some of them, Philip, I have a question, and that's about one of the big dilemmas of internationalization. In fact, this is something which I've always grappled with, which is that the two ways by which people are benefited on mobility-based internationalization on the student side is those who got scholarship or those who can afford, and both of which the number is so less. So the reality then is internationalization in any form seems to be only for the privileged because of their brilliance or excellence measured in whatever ways, or if they can afford it. So my question is, how do we democratize the future of internationalization to make it more accessible and inclusive?
Of course, that's a fundamental question. There are a couple of, there's no really good answer, but there are a couple of parts. One of those parts is, of course, internationalization at home. That is to provide students on campus, wherever they may be, with a much more focused international global perspective on whatever they're studying, and broadly, both through the curriculum and through the extracurriculum. And there are many ways. I alluded to a few of them in my comments before. The other is to be much more sensitive to who is studying abroad and to provide opportunities through scholarships and so on, through better selection methods, through being aware of inclusiveness and so on, for students broadly, and to try to make sure that it's not just these elites, as you correctly point out, either the knowledge elites or the monetary elites. But underlying all this, and also related to Steve's comments, international mobility is going to be for a small number regardless. And in the era of climate change and so on, those numbers are not going to get all that much larger for reasons, for many reasons, one of them being the environment. So that's my answer. Inclusiveness when selecting for students who can go abroad, and especially underline internationalization at home. And very few universities have really focused on that.
Thank you so much, Philip. There are several questions, but I'll quickly take up one or two. again to Philip, examining the higher education landscape of India when compared to countries like Japan, China, and Singapore, what do you think India can do to enhance internationalization in higher education, particularly when you expressed the fact that there is some element of desire that's happening as we speak?
Well, as I said, better infrastructure, clearer policies, which make sense, and a number of the policies which have been proposed both in the NEP and in the earlier legislation, which languished for years, were kind of not very smart and won't be successful. So India needs to step back, maybe look with its international partners at what can be successful. I've noticed that Indian higher education generally and Indian universities in particular don't take as much advantage as some other countries do in the expertise and the experience of what's happening in other parts of the world. And I think that can be useful.
Thank you very much, Philip. Steve, there's a question about, in the current times, many nations are witnessing increasing polarization and ideas of excessive nationalism. This is visible in the protests breaking around the world over issues of nationality, migration, religious identities, and more recently in movements like Black Lives Matters. Given this reality, what future do you envisage for internationalization?
Wow, that is truly a critical issue because it. Oh, yeah.
1 or 2 minutes, yeah.
Okay, so the politicization and the trends towards authoritarianism affect major countries across the world. My own country, your country, Brazil, Philippines, European countries, we can name them all. We know how bad that it has got. And the universities have a major challenge to reaffirm their role as places where true academic freedom and freedom of thought is encouraged and enhanced, and people learn how to think critically and to engage with others with mutual respect, and to avoid the politicization of the educational world, as with the politicization of the functioning of the institutions of the country, and move away from that trend. It is the most dangerous and disheartening dimensions of the last 20 years or so has been this trend. And it is up to the youth to reverse it. And it is with the youth and the movements of the youth, including Black Lives Matter, but many other youth movements on the environment and other areas, where we see some hope that the stupidity and the narrow-mindedness of some of the leaders of the world today will be replaced by young people restoring the sense of global cooperation, international understanding, and to achieve peace and harmony in the world, which I think should be an ideal of universities.
Thank you very much, Steve. Philip, there is a very interesting question which I've also battled with for a long time. One of the things that the COVID-19 crisis has demonstrated is that the big international universities, particularly in the Western world, Australia, even United States, of course, UK, have been hugely dependent upon fee-paying international students. And suddenly their entire economic structure has been shaken up. Now, of course, so the question is really, is it possible how can we avoid marketization of the kind of internationalization that has happened, in which the only model that is currently have, which we have all celebrated, is that 90% of international revenue students coming, and say less than 10% you provide scholarship, and the entire structure and the budget is based upon this 90% fee-paying students coming from Asia and Latin America and Africa. Is there another model out there?
No.
Okay.
The only other model that's out there is one that places less stress on the financial aspect of international students. And that will require for public universities in the rich countries to simply devote more funding to higher education. And if you look at what's happened in Australia, which is the best example of this, the government some years ago now, and by the way, both political parties in Australia have pursued the same policy. There's no difference between the left and the right, it seems. The government has said to the Australian universities, hey guys, balance your budget on the basis of fee-paying foreign students. So what are the universities going to do? They did that so they could survive. And until that mentality changes, the reality which you described, Raj, will continue. Top private universities, which especially in the US and a little bit in Japan, that have significant endowments, can provide more funding for international students, scholarships, and other kinds of programs. But the number of those universities is very small. A country which doesn't conform to these unpleasant realities, which you have correctly pointed out, is Germany, which has overall free tuition, some differences among the German states, and has not looked nationally at international students as cash cows, as sources of revenue. And I think the German example is very important. Interestingly, some countries which were on the German side of things, like Sweden, have changed and have become a little bit more commercialized. So that's an overly long answer to a very fundamental question.
Thank you very much, Philip. We're just coming to the end. We have like 3 minutes or so. One quick question to Steve. Because we believe in the notions of internationalization, even if resources becomes an impediment, what are the possible ways by which we can promote the concept or the framework of internationalism or internationalization at home, in the sense that what kind of ecosystem institutions in their respective countries can create with a view to foster a sense of internationalism among the students?
Yes, that's a point that Phil addressed in alluding to internationalization at home through the curriculum, through programs. You can design the curriculum in such a way that students are exposed to other ways of thinking, other civilizations, and so on. And I think that's been done to a certain degree, but it could be improved on a great deal. There are ways in which collaborations through ICT now, at a time when we are prevented from doing it in the normal type of exchanges through travel, will have to increase, in which we will have opportunities for joint courses taking place. And again, we have a problem here of synchronicity and the time zones. But so we have to figure out ways of overcoming the time zone issue so that we can have joint classes with students in other parts of the world. So the curriculum needs to be designed in such a way that there's an openness to other civilizations and societies. Secondly, that there are opportunities to engage with other students. Language education is another important dimension of that. So I think the internationalization at home has a lot to do with the openness to engaging through ICT with other countries, and by having the curriculum designed in such a way that students have ample opportunity to become aware that we are all together on this planet.
Thank you. And we'll have the last question to Philip, and you'll have
if I can make just one sentence on the last, the last response, which is universities have to be deliberate in their policies about internationalization at home, and to take it seriously and to devote resources to it. And there's so far lots of talk and not very much action.
Gotcha. Philip, last question to you. I know you have been advising people at the highest levels of government and governance in China and Russia, and help them, with regard to empowering them in internationalization and rankings. So if you if you were to have the ears of our Prime Minister, or let's say Human Resources Minister, what would be your piece of advice when India is aspiring to become a global hub of higher education, particularly for the South? There is a lot of talk about, large parts of when Asia has 60% of the world's population. You have, of course, Africa, and many of them cannot simply afford to go to any part of the Western world. So how can India become a global hub of higher education?
Fundamental question. And one, more resources have to be devoted to higher education. No question. India has lagged behind in proportion of GDP, however you want to measure it, in supporting higher education over the years. Two, to make some serious, rational decisions on a relatively small number, probably public and private, of Indian universities that have the potential to become world-class. Everybody can't do it. All higher education systems are segmented, and that's fine and appropriate. But the Indian universities which aspire to and can involve themselves in world-class endeavors should be appropriately supported. Three, the private sector in India, and this is occurring, including, as an example, your own university. People have stepped up for the first time in many years to support a number of these new private startups. There should be a way, don't ask me how, for public-private partnerships in these areas so that some of the public universities, mired in bureaucracy as they are, can take advantage in creative ways of this kind of money. There is money in India, both in the public sector and in the private sector. It needs to be harnessed. To continue to stress English. English is the global language of science. And I read with a little trepidation some of the recommendations in the NEP report about maybe de-emphasizing somewhat English. I think there are problems. I know that in the Indian context, but I think that's overall a mistake. And my final comment is don't pay too much attention to the global rankings. They tell you something, but if you try to force yourself into the into the metrics that they use, if you try to use them too much, it's a fool's errand. It's not going to get you where you want to be.
Well, thank you very much, Philip, for your fascinating keynote address, and also reflecting on the future of internationalizations with implications for India. I cannot imagine anybody else in the world who could speak with so much of authority and depth of knowledge and perspectives born out of experience and understanding of the complexities and the challenges of the global higher education landscape, but also the context of several countries in the world. So I'm deeply grateful to you for joining us in this conference and delivering this fascinating lecture. I'm also grateful to my dear colleague and friend, Professor Stephen P. Marks, for delivering the presidential address and being part of this particular keynote address. Thank you to both of you.